ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come.
Hello, I am Jeffrey Fletcher, and I would like to take a moment to say before I begin today's show, there are conversations I wish would be the normal of the day, which is every day. What I mean by the normal of the day conversation should be about bridging the racial divide, unemployment, homelessness, the cure for childhood adult diseases, and equality. Instead, the normal acceptance of the conversation of the day is the silent dog whistle remarks toward minorities, making homophobic, misogynistic, and divisive attitudes towards women and the handicapped. Today's show will follow my commentary only because I was pained this past weekend by the remarks made by the President of the United States, referencing to the NFL football players as sons of bitches because they took a stance with fellow player Colin Kaepernick in taking a knee during the national anthem. So in closing, let's support and make normal conversations of the day about things that matter, which concern all Americans and affect all Americans. Today, we will be discussing the who, what, wheres, and whys of Jim Crow and segregation. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the South. Segregation was mandated in all public facilities throughout the South from the 1890s to the 1969 in America, starting in 1896 with a separate but equal status for African Americans who were employed by railroads and other jobs. Jim Crow legalized segregation between African Americans and whites. The name is believed to be derived from a character in a popular minstrel song. After the Civil War, there was a period from 1865 to 1877 where federal laws offered observable protection of civil rights for former slaves and free blacks. However, starting in the 1870s, as the Southern economy continued to its decline, Democrats took over power in Southern legislatures and used intimidation tactics to suppress African American voters. Those tactics that included violence, scrutinization of African Americans, to which those other tactics continued well into the 1900s. Lynchings were a common form of terrorism practiced against African Americans to intimidate them from turning out at the precincts voting polls. It is important to remember that Democrats and Republicans of the 1800s were very different in party principles and theory from what we see today. Republicans during and around the period of the Civil War and directly after were literally the party of Lincoln and the savior to the South. As white Southern Democrats took over the legislative branches of government in the former Confederate states, they began passing more restrictive voter registration and electoral laws, just as well as passing legislation to segregate African Americans and whites from coexisting. It was not enough just to separate African Americans. Segregation was never really about separate but equal. While the Supreme Court naively speculated in the famous case Plessy versus Ferguson, somehow mankind would not show its worst in nature, and segregation could occur without one side being significantly disadvantaged. We can now look back in hindsight and see that the Supreme Court was either foolishly optimistic or just suffering from the same racism that gripped the arms of government at that time. So in practice, the services and facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior, underfunded, and more inconvenient as compared to those that were offered to whites. Or, for that matter, the services and facilities did not even exist at all for African Americans. Meanwhile, as segregation was practiced in the South, it was also practiced in the North just as well, where housing patterns were enforced by private and secretive covenants. Bank lending practices and employment discrimination were commonly practiced. Unfortunately, this type of de facto segregation has lasted well into the narrative of today. The era of Jim Crow laws saw a dramatic reduction in the number of blacks registered to vote all across the South. That was due to terroristic behavior which was maliciously and criminally directed at African Americans at the polls within their counties. This period of time brought about the great migration of African Americans to geographical locations in the United States, such as cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Those cities were some of the biggest geographical locations where African Americans migrated to from the South. By the way, this is as good of a time to discuss the similarities of the same migratory practices and patterns my parents and relatives traveled as they made their journey from the South to the North, where they eventually settled in a small place called Colchester, Connecticut. You see, the 1920s seen the Ku Klux Klan's resurgence, where recruitment and membership increased in states all over the country. As Jim Crow and segregation was the politics of the day, the Klan have found a significant popularity that was found to continue recruitment and membership to this day with the use of technology. The Ku Klux Klan have experienced a reincarnation of its membership, which has tripled nationwide, especially with the rhetoric that has spewed within the past 7 months of 2016 and 17. The Ku Klux Klan did not shy away from using burning crosses and other means of violence and intimidation to instill fear into their adversaries, anti-segregationists, and not limited to African Americans, but including Catholics, Jews, and anyone who was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. All of the aforementioned were considered the enemy of God and the imperial order of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Examples of Jim Crow laws where African Americans were not eligible to serve on juries, they could not run for local offices, they were not acknowledged as second-rate citizens, and they were considered inferior to every white man or woman. While public schools had been established by Reconstruction legislatures for the first time in most southern states, schools for African American children were consistently underfunded compared to schools for white children. So like schools, public libraries for African Americans were underfunded if they existed at all. They were often stocked with secondhand books and other supplies which white schools had no use for. Schools, libraries, and other public facilities were not introduced for African Americans in the South until the first decade of the 20th century. It should be noted that throughout this Jim Crow era, libraries were only available sparsely for African Americans to use. Prior to the 20th century, most libraries established for African Americans were a combination of the school and library all being in one. Another Jim Crow law was progressive measures intended to reduce election fraud, such as the 8-box law, which originates from the South, as well as rural communities throughout the South and the Southwest. The 8-box law was put in place against African American and white voters who were deemed illiterate. If they could not read or write and could not follow sure directions, then they were not allowed to cast their vote. The separation of African Americans from the general population was becoming legalized during the progressive era between the 1890s to the 1920s. It was becoming customary, for instance, even in cases in which Jim Crow laws did not expressly forbid African Americans from participating in sports. That African Americans would stay in their place, that was the common sense. But Jim Crow came directly to home with how it affected my family, where housing practices was concerned. The housing and banking covenants were put in place to tempt my family from purchasing a home in a white neighborhood. I discussed this account of redlining by the bank and real estate agents several times in previous episodes as a young child growing up in the year of 1963 in rural Connecticut. As one of 4 children, my younger sister suffered from chronic asthma, which resulted in ongoing treatments she needed treatment every week. After numerous close calls where my sister's health was in jeopardy and the rising costs of medical bills became steep, my parents thought it was time to look for a new home, which would be free of dust and mold. In their search for a suitable home for us, my parents were befriended by a Jewish family who owned a real estate company. My parents met them as they were settling down over the years in Colchester. Now, my mother shared with my brother and sisters how many times the realtors were related to the same Jewish family who had allowed her housing as she arrived in Colchester as a young lady from the South. Well, I'm going to cut through the chase. As the story goes, when my parents finally located the house they would eventually buy and make our second childhood home, little did they ever think they would encounter Jim Crow and his dark presence following them from the South to the North. Well, I remember like it was yesterday when my brother and older sister found out that we were moving from Wyndham Avenue to Park Avenue, not New York. As much as I could remember, all I knew was that we were no longer going to live at that old house, as we called it. Plus, I would no longer have to listen to my sister wheezing and my mother pacing the floor all night, wondering whether she would see the next day. I can remember sitting in the back seat of that car as the sun was going down one late evening, only to learn the car ride to our new house was short-lived because it was across town, about less than 3 miles from my old house. As night had deeply descended upon us, I can remember my father stopping the car at the top of the street to where our new house was, and a bald white man walking up to the car. The only thing I can recall was that the white man had returned back to his car after talking to my father and drove off, and my father then drove by a house we later moved into. Now, what I did not know until 25 years later, which was revealed to me, was that my family had to look at the house at night, which we later moved into. And to add insult to injury, we moved into this house at night as well. So I can remember asking my father, why were we moving into our new house during the nighttime, which were my exact words. My father said it was because he was working all day and didn't have time, and the only time he could do it, move in and look, was during the night. So we fast forward 50 years ago to 2016. There was another new revelation around the new house we moved into back during the 60s. My brother, who's a fan of social media, not me, left Colchester after graduation from high school for college 50 years ago. Unlike me, he always remained in touch with classmates and friends and via Facebook and other social media venues. One night, my brother called me to tell me he had heard from one of my childhood neighborhood friends through Facebook. I asked him who had contacted him. He told me it was Craig from the old neighborhood. My brother proceeded to tell me Craig had seen him on Facebook and decided to reach out to him. He said Craig told him when the news had got out in our neighborhood that black people were buying a house, the neighbors immediately generated a petition to keep our family from moving into our new house. He told my brother, matter of fact, one of the petitioners came to his father's house wanting his father and mother to sign it. He told my brother when the neighbor explained to his father that the neighborhood was trying to do this petition, his father asked the petitioner to get off of his property. Now, from what my brother told me, which was told by my friend Craig, the petitioner hesitated to leave, which resulted in his father punching the neighbor in the face. Craig's father made him vow not to tell us and my family that that incident ever occurred. So, as you can see, as I have been discussing, racism, discrimination, prejudice was a common practice throughout the United States, not only below the Mason-Dixon, but right here in Colchester, Connecticut. The practice used by realtors to keep my family out of our new home was called redlining, which was usually practiced by a bank. This was a common practice in real estate and in business, and presently is often tried from time to time even today. Let me tell you, Jim Crow was alive and well living in the Northeast. While collecting artifacts and memorabilia, I have come across through auctions, estate sales, and online biddings, and even donations, some of the most disturbing signs, which you'll see over my shoulder, which were against African Americans and doing business with African Americans. When the signs are placed on display in venues, people have a difficult time trying to process the image they see, which were signs posted on walls in restaurant, trains, and bus stations across the country. Signs, white only, we cater to whites only, no dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans, colored must sit in the balcony. Those signs were iconic from the 1920s as late as the early 1970s in some rural southern communities. Those signs were very demonstrative in getting their message across to any African American and entered into any public building and space in the South. If at any time those signs were ignored, the owners of those businesses could call the police. Imagine, right here in the United States, there were actually signs which were deliberately posted that could tell a certain segment of our society they were prohibited from eating, sitting, and where they could go to the bathroom. Imagine. As I'm telling you this account of Jim Crow and segregation, I still cannot wrap my brain around the fact that this was one of the most poignant times in America. Yet this was supposed to be the home of the land and the land of the free. I love telling stories which, by the way, are true, and I believe it puts a face on Jim Crow. There will be many accounts throughout our journey down the path of discussing the images of America. From time to time, I will interject stories as were told to me by my mother and relatives who survived Jim Crow. I want to preface again, as I will do throughout the episodes that I do, that in no way, shape, or form are the stories or the content told to be are divisive, but it's true to educate. My mother told me when she arrived from Camden, South Carolina to Colchester, Connecticut in the 1940s, she was befriended, as I said, and taken in by the Jewish family I had mentioned earlier. She had said one day the Jewish woman mentioned to her that she wanted to go shopping and have lunch at this popular department store which was equivalent to the Macy's of the time and of this day. My mother said she was very excited this woman wanted to take her shopping and then to have lunch with her. She said they arrived at the store and proceeded to shop, which she said they both had an opportunity to talk and laugh and joke. My mother said after they were done shopping, they agreed they would go to the store lunch counter where they can sit and have lunch. Now, here's the irony of this whole story, which goes like this. As I have laid the foundation of segregation and Jim Crow in this episode, here was my mother, a colored woman, which I use that term to identify because that was the period of time she was living, to have been invited to lunch and shop in the North in an all-white department store, which was a culture shock for her. What must have been running through her mind? She was frightened because a year or so prior to moving to the North, Jim Crow was alive and well in her life. In her mind, she was allowed to live, travel, shop, and eat with white people, whereas perhaps a year prior to, as I said, arrival to Connecticut, she had seen signs stating to no colored allowed and no colored served. My mother said when she and the white woman sat at the counter to order their food, they picked up the menu up from the counter and began to look it over. My mother said as they placed their menus down onto the counter, an older white waitress sauntered over to them. My mother said then the waitress looked at the white woman that she was with, never looking at her, and addressed her friend, "Ma'am, I'm not allowed to serve colored." My mother said she was not at all surprised by the comment of the waitress because she had heard that comment oh so many times. The white Jewish woman she was with became enraged and asked the waitress the reason why her friend, who she considered my mother as her daughter, was being refused service. The waitress said, "That's the rules here in this store and restaurant." The Jewish woman who had brought my mother to the store said that she knew the family personally who owned the department store. My mother said that information the woman was trying to convey fell on deaf ears. And as far as she was concerned, rules were rules. The white woman said to my mother, Ruby, which was my mom's name, "Let's leave, and when we get home, I'm going to call the owners of the store." My mother had told me she thought there was going to be a problem where she was going to be blamed and charged with violating Jim Crow laws of Connecticut. The white woman was true to her word when she got home because, as my mother said, she'd no sooner to take her hat off, she ran to the telephone and began to frantically dial the telephone, rotary phones back then. My mother said she sat and listened to the white woman as she was dialing the telephone. She finally got connected to the person she was calling. My mother said, all she heard was the person at the other end of the phone was called, and that she was not, that told her she was not waiting on at this restaurant where my mom and her had gone. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot. There's an ending to this story, which was the Jewish woman who knew the owners of the store was successful in the white waitress being fired. My mother and her Jewish friend had gone shopping and had lunch numerous times after, and it was at the G. Fox and Company department store located in Hartford, Connecticut for many years after. Now, as I tell this story, and I only tell this story only because, again, as I keep referencing to my episodes and my lectures, is that Jim Crow was in existence, was practiced, may have been overt in the South, but here in the Northeast and other parts of the country, it was covertly practiced. And there may not have been signs up, but there were signs that were embedded, ingrained in people's minds that saw segregation as being something that was of a positive. So in closing, I just want to tell this one story. Over my shoulder, there is there's an assortment of signs, segregation signs, Jim Crow signs. But one story stands out in my mind, and will always stand out in my mind, is that I do school lectures and presentations. And so I happened to do this school lecture and presentation just as I'm doing this segment now. And what happened after this lecture brought pain to my heart, and it dovetails into where we are now with immigration laws and the DACA students. So as I finished my presentation, I noticed two students standing around after as I was picking up and trying to get things all ready to move out. And as I started picking these items up, I seen these two students, and I seen one weeping. And as I'm looking at one of the students weeping, I walk over and I say, "What's wrong?" And the student says to me, "My friend's upset because there was something that triggered an emotion in her." And so at this point, I looked, and to put some context to this, the two students, they must have been about my daughter's age, 16 and 17, and they were Latino. And so I asked the young lady that was crying, I asked her to sit down because we were in an auditorium. And so as I'm sitting there with her, I asked her, "What's wrong?" And she said, I'm just so upset because I love my father dearly. And I love my father so much that I talk to him every morning. Now, mind you, her mom and dad had been separated. And so when she was growing up, that's all she knew, male figure in her life, that was her father. And even though they were separated, her father still had contact to her every day when she left for school and when she came home from school. And so when I was doing this presentation using these Jim Crow signs, one of the signs that stuck out to her was, "No Mexicans, Negroes, or dogs allowed." And so she happened to be of Mexican, and she happened to be a Mexican-American, meaning she was born here in these United States, but her family, her mother and father, or her father, I'm sorry, was not a documented person. And so her fear was that he was going to be rounded up. And this happened right after the inauguration and all this controversy that was being discussed about undocumented workers and undocumented people being rounded up by ICE and deported. And so her biggest fear wasn't gangs, wasn't food, wasn't any of those things, her grades. Her biggest fear that she feared was coming home after school and not getting that phone call from her father to ask how her day was. So as I tell this story now, I have a chill that goes up my spine, but that will always stand out in my mind and in my head of what else these signs mean to as we go into not Jim Crow, but Jim Crow Esquire of the day. And I leave you on that note, and I thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to next week. Good night.
I was born by the river, since. It's been a long